Um, colleagues? I'm not sure if the microphone is on. Yes, now you can hear me. Good afternoon or good evening. My name is Kārlis Bukovskis. I'm the Deputy Director of the Latvian Institute of International Affairs, for those of you who don't know me. I'll be moderating this panel, this event, which is entitled Containment or Reengagement, the Future of Relations Between Russia and the West. So I welcome you all to this event. We are very happy that you had found time to be present and participate. I'm very glad to see so many distinguished guests here as well. It's always nice to see decision makers and actual implementers during different seminars. This event is organized by the Latvian Institute of International Affairs together with the Nuclear Threat Initiative, European Leadership Network, and of course, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. We have gathered here, to discuss this troubling situation that we are currently in the European security seeing, and which the Russian and Ukrainian conflict has stirred up last year, and maybe already before that. So there have been quite a lot of worries voiced by different regions, not only the Baltic states and Poland, but also in some further places in the European Union and also outside the European borders. At the same time, of course, not only the worries have been called for, but also we see that there's a mobilization of different sectors and industries has been taking place, which maybe has been a long time forgotten in some of the countries. So we can see that especially the military have been regaining their importance and essence in their functioning. Of course, Russia previously wasn't seen as an immediate threat, and especially in case of the Baltic states as not being as an immediate threat, we could see that the military and security issues weren't that high on the agenda as they have become in the few last month. So finally, the question is, when we will be discussing what is Russia planning on doing? What are the Western countries planning on doing? What is the Western world, transatlantic world, planning on doing regarding the relationship with NATO? And the question is, of course, that to some analysts, the Russian activities are being so clear that they are just simply seen as unbelievable. Because some people just simply foresee this as a classical geopolitical expansion which could be taking place. But of course, this is our task today to discuss this. So we have to discuss, does Russia really need to be contained? What is Russia trying to prove? And are we actually heading towards a new Cold War situation, or do we have any alternative plans? Okay, with this, I'm going to finish on the introduction because I have an exquisite panel today with me, and I don't want to take the air and let my colleagues speak. So my task here will be only to limit your interventions to about 5 minutes, and I will be watching the watch, and of course I'll try to stop you whenever I'll see it as necessary. So, and afterwards we will proceed with questions from the audience. So we will proceed in the list which has been already issued to you, and in this case we're going to start with Professor Dr. Janos Martonyi, politician and the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Hungary from 1998 until 2002, and then from 2010 until 2014. What is worth mentioning, of course, that you were the Minister of Foreign Affairs during the Hungarian presidency of the Council of the European Union. Also participated in the Amato Group, which unofficially drafted the new treaty of the European Union after the European Constitution failed in referendums. And so in this case, I give the floor to you, as you said that you have very limited time. So the floor is yours, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for this very unique opportunity to say one or two words about, as the title says, towards the new state of relationship with Russia. Now, I will be very, very brief for at least 3 reasons. First, of course, I want to give more time for my fellow panelists Second, I have to run to the airport immediately after my very short intervention. Number three, I have been allocated 5 minutes. So it's not an easy subject. Because now we are speaking about, I understand, the future of relationship with Russia. How can you forecast the future in the present situation when we are in the middle of a very, very serious international crisis caused by the violation of basic principles and rules of international law by a country which is a permanent member of the Security Council and one of the two nuclear superpowers. It's a crisis which created a completely new security situation, not only in the region, including, of course, Central Europe and the Baltics, but I would say in the whole world. So we are confronted with this situation, and all that is now happening in a world which is, even apart from this crisis, economic, geopolitical, defense, and so on. So even apart from this crisis, is characterized by complexity, growing complexity, unpredictability, and fragmentation. We all know about the so-called butterfly effect, which is no longer an effect. It is, in fact, a butterfly defect, which means that there are many unforeseen and, in fact, unintended consequences we cannot fully forecast and measure. Some people even say, in respect of the fragmentation, which is part of the story and the complexity, that there is no such thing as a single world order. There are several orders. I don't want to refer back to Huntington because that is a somewhat different approach. By the way, he never advocated the clash of civilizations. He was describing a situation, and he also made some suggestions how to avoid it. But coming back to the subject, there are several orders that is civilizational and cultural systems under divergent or differing ordering norms. And if that is the case, the first question we have to answer, where does Russia belong to? Of course, your response could be immediately that this is up to the Russians to decide, and I agree. They are now at the crossroads. It's kind of bifurcation. They have to decide themselves. Now, in the long run, I have no doubt, in the long run, in addition to the fact that we are all dead, as you know it very well, in the long run, Russia does belong to what we call the West. Always a little bit special because of geography, because of history, but as far as culture and civilization is concerned, Russia does belong to the West. I said in the long run. In most cases, it's fairly easy to say what is going to happen in the long run. We have some forecast with respect to the world in 15, 20, or 25 years. It is enormously more difficult to tell you what is going to happen in the upcoming months. And that's where we are facing all the very serious risks and threats. I believe, to shorten a little bit this 5 minutes intervention, that the key for the short term is in the pocket of Russia's president. And that's why I am saying that Russia is at a crossroads. They have to decide whether they want to escalate with enormously serious threats. Just have a look at the nuclear element I tried to refer to. And unintended consequences nobody can foresee or forecast. Or we start a different process, they start a different process, he starts a different process, which is the other way around, tuning down, as it was said this afternoon. Some people criticize the word de-escalation. I mean, whatever word you might choose. The basic point is that a reverse process should now be started. Everybody knows what it is. It's the full and complete implementation of the Minsk agreement, and then, of course, building up, restoring progressively with determination the trust and confidence between the parties. Final word, Russia, of course, turned out to be very good in the field of tactics. The president is a good tactician. I'm not sure that he's a good strategist. And many of us have the feeling that, in fact, inadvertently, Putin midwifed the rebirth of the Ukrainian nation, which will turn to the West from now on. We do not know yet in what procedure and within what territorial boundaries. But all in all, I think the outcome will not be very happy for those who generated this serious crisis or conflict I was speaking about. Now, this is the very general picture. I understand that there are many, many more details which should be discussed. Many people are now trying to find the way out, the solution. I think if we agree at least on that point that we are all responsible in different measure or size, but we are all responsible for a better outcome, then we already reached some consensus, and maybe we have made a very small step forward. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor. I want to use an opportunity to ask you still one question from my side, if there aren't any, of course, from the audience, which you want to immediately state as you have to be leaving. My question is very simple. How do you perceive balancing the Western and Russian interests?
Balancing?
Where is the common ground for Russian and Western interests? How do you see them?
There is a huge degree of interdependence, economic, geopolitical, and otherwise. I only wanted to refer briefly to the cultural aspect because I find it very important. Also in view of the fact that, as we discussed it this morning, there are very strong psychological and emotional, therefore cultural elements in the whole story. And that's why I say that in the long run, Russia and the West, especially Europe, they have fundamental common strategic interests. The question is how fast everybody will grasp these common interests, and of course how this kind of mutual respect, trust, and confidence can be built.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Not yet. Okay, then in this case I will use the... Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. A round of applause, if we may. With this, I'm going to be turning now to Yawn. Yawn, who in this case is the co-founder and director of the European Leadership Network, and has also been an acting director of the Institute for Public Policy Research in the United Kingdom, has been also lecturing at the University of Sheffield, has written quite a lot of articles, and every week I keep receiving your articles in my mail. And and is an expert on national security and Britain's special relationship with the US and also in the EU enlargement policies. So with this, I would like you to have your 5 minutes and explain how do you see that.
Well, let me, if I may, start by answering the question that you just asked Janos Martonyi, which is in relation to the common interests, and let's agree, let's get real about the situation. The one fundamental common interest we all have together is avoiding mutual annihilation. And we have a confrontation now going on between a nuclear-armed state and potentially a nuclear-armed alliance. That's the situation we're in, if you look at it in Russia-West terms, as opposed to just focusing on the internal situation in Ukraine. In response to that situation, I want to structure my comments around three principal ideas. Those are resolve, restraint, and dialogue. On the resolve side of the equation, I think there are certain things that have to happen if we're going to stop this situation getting out of control. The first thing I think is there's been much talk of red lines. It has to be communicated to the current Russian leadership that NATO territory is off limits and that that is a definite red line and that he cannot in any way miscalculate in relation to that. I think to make that real, there needs to be more, and I choose my words carefully here, persistent basing of forces in the Baltic states. We are, of course, all aware that we're working on this creation of a spearhead force in NATO. But it's going to take quite a while to put together. Some estimates it's going to take another couple of years before the force is ready. I think we need something on the ground now. Frankly, the most important thing really that needs to be communicated to the Russian leadership is that the Americans would be involved in any kind of confrontation from day one. And I think there needs to be a sufficient presence here to demonstrate that so that it's not in any way ambiguous. Beyond that, there are a whole range of other things we need to do under this banner of resolve, including exercising for hybrid warfare contingencies, taking more measures to make particularly countries in this region, but in other parts of Europe as well, more resilient to hybrid attacks. I have in my papers here a recent analysis by Janos Berzins here on new generation Russian warfare and Latvian defense policy. He makes some very interesting comments about how economic insecurity can be connected with reduced loyalty to nation and that there is academic research and literature to support that thesis. And what he's saying is that in a country like this, where economic development is concentrated around Riga, that more needs to be done with regional economic development policy. And he's linking that to part of your country's national security strategy, and I think he's right to do so in the context of hybrid challenges. We need to increase NATO infrastructure in Eastern Europe, and I think we need to be willing to pursue more targeted sanctions. We also need to provide more support for reform in Ukraine to help the Ukrainians deal with the enormous challenges they have. And I think we should not only look to provide diplomatic support for the peace process in Ukraine, but we also need to help Ukraine to defend itself. Because I personally think if Ukraine is defenseless, I'm not sure that it will be allowed to successfully reform and develop itself. Now, having said that, that's resolve. This is a dangerous situation, and I think precisely because it's a dangerous situation between a nuclear-armed state and a nuclear-armed alliance, there has to be some limits to resolve. And this is where the theme of restraint comes in. I think we need to be exercising restraint in a number of areas, and I can elaborate on this at greater length, but I'll just give you a few examples. So we need restraint in the application of economic sanctions. We may have to increase them if the situation gets worse, but the sanctions should be targeted. Last December, when the ruble fell quite sharply one particular day, in a number of European capitals there was instant concern that the Russian economy was going to collapse. Nobody in Western Europe wants the Russian economy to collapse for two reasons. We think it would threaten regime viability in Moscow. Nobody knows what would come next. And if Russia became a failed state, it would be a failed state with nuclear weapons. There are limits to how far you want to crush the Russian economy. You have to exercise some restraint. I think what that means is sanctions need to be applied to areas like technology transfer and to specific initiatives. So, for example, no investment, no engagement in Crimea, those kinds of targeted sanctions. We need restraint in the approach of helping Ukraine to defend itself. NATO countries, in my view, should not provide lethal aid to Ukraine. We should provide command and control support, training support, logistics, battlefield situational awareness technology, and so on. But Ukraine both has a large defense industry, which is capable of churning out a lot of weapons, but there are over 60 major arms exporting countries in the world, and only a small group of those are NATO countries. So the weapons can come from somewhere else to avoid turning this confrontation into a proxy war between NATO and Russia. And we need restraint in areas like military deployments. There's been a raging debate in some of the literature, strategic literature in recent months between some who are arguing that in response to President Putin's nuclear saber-rattling, that we should be considering deploying nuclear weapons in this part of Europe. I think that would be a dangerous escalation and that there should be no such deployment. If we got to the stage where we needed to demonstrate in some way to President Putin that NATO is a nuclear-armed alliance, that could be done in other ways by perhaps exercising some of the dual-capable aircraft that can perform nuclear missions in this region, but certainly not basing nuclear weapons here. As I said, I could go on with other examples, but just one I want to mention where I think restraint is important. I think our leaders need to exercise restraint in their public discussion of intelligence reports about what Russian military units are doing in Ukraine. Some of the NATO commanders, and I'm thinking about General Breedlove in particular, have been extremely hawkish out in the public space, articulating, and some would argue, quite exaggerated claims about what Russian forces have been doing, and doing it deliberately, frankly, to try and bounce his own administration in Washington into taking a more hawkish position. And he has been challenged publicly by the German intelligence service, which has disputed some of his intelligence assessments. So we need restraint in public language. And my final point, because I know I'm out of time, relates to the third issue of dialogue. There are lots of areas where we need to engage in dialogue with Russia. One of them, an important one, is arms control. Now is a good time to try and have an arms control conversation with Russia. There is, I think, an important need to engage with Russia on the economic agenda, the trilateral conversation which is going on between the European Union, Ukrainian government and Russia, both on paying for gas and on the implementation of the EU association agreement. Both of those conversations could be a bridgehead to a much wider economic conversation about how the EU, Ukraine and Russia could work together economically in a more productive way. There are other areas where we should be looking to pursue cooperation. One of them, I think, is in people-to-people movement and exchanges and civil society engagement. At the moment, we run the risk, we've already closed down almost all of the significant diplomatic channels of engagement with Russia. The State Department is now stopping in the US groups of US citizens, NGO activity going to Russia. There's a US funder, a large US funder, which was just hoping to give a grant to some American universities and in the end couldn't do it because the State Department won't let them go ahead and do the activities they wanted to do. We should not be isolating Russian society, we should be engaging with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kearns. I have also a question for you prepared already, and you mentioned that the on-the-ground troops should be in the region. The question is of mine: how far do you see the UK's extension of presence?
Well, the UK would be expected, like other countries, to make some sort of contribution to that. But I think everybody knows the important presence needs to be an American presence. Of course, it needs to be a NATO presence. Other countries need to be involved, and the UK, I think, could be persuaded to contribute to that in the right circumstances.
Okay. Thank you. Now I'm going to turn to my left. There are three speakers, excellent speakers on my left as well. So we will have to, well, in this case, start with Margarita Šešelgytė, who is the Studies Director at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science at the Vilnius University, and has been an expert on military issues, including working for the Lithuanian Military Academy, and on security matters in general. So if you could give us a little bit of the Baltic perspective this time, please.
Thank you, Kārlis, very much, and thanks the organizers of the conference for giving me an opportunity to speak for you. And well, Kārlis should have also mentioned that I used to work at the Baltic Defense College, so I'm sort of entitled to give the Baltic position on Western Russian relations. And I would say that, well, usually when Lithuanian starts to speak about relations with Russia, everyone expects that it's going to be a very hawkish position. And misunderstand me correctly, but Lithuania, above all, is interested in the progressive, modern, democratic, and strong economically Russia. And therefore, we've been following a lot what was happening in Russia, the developments in Russia since the 90s. And I could say that the relations of Russia and West could be separated in several stages. At the beginning, West looked towards Russia with a certain degree of the suspicion. Will Russia be democratic eventually, or maybe it's just a new Soviet Union? But then there was a very rapid turn into a very optimistic attitude, believed that by integrating Russia into the international institutions, Western international institutions, by increasing the level of economic interdependence, West would drag Russia into the Western society. Russia eventually would become a democratic country. So there was this cooperative approach towards Russia and the belief that Russia would become a democratic country. And even when there was an attack against Georgia, European Union and in general, West were still sticking to this cooperative approach towards Russia. They were ready to cooperate. There were beliefs that maybe Russia was provoked, maybe we have to listen to them to understand their part of the story. In parallel, during the events in Georgia, there were also other events taking place on the international system. First of all, there were clear indications that United States are redrafting their strategic priorities and are taking more interest in Asia than in Europe. And at the same time, the economic crisis was happening in the European Union. And this turbulent situation actually was causing a certain turbulence and also provoking, triggering adventurism of the dissatisfied powers. And I would argue that the Russian regime is one of those dissatisfied powers, because despite all efforts to integrate Russia into the international system, Western institutions, G8, World Trade Organization, etc., 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 Russia in the current international system was losing the relevance. Cooperative Russia was not very relevant in the international system. No progress, no sound economy, and lack, from their point of view, of respect on the international stage. So what Russian regime started to do, it started to attack the contemporary international institutions. And first of all, the principles of contemporary world order, the principle of the integrity of the territorial integrity. Secondly, it started to suggest that alternative institutions might be created, that we supplement or replace the existing institutions as entirely ineffective. We talked today about the need of new security architecture, and it's not a new idea. This idea was proposed already by Mr. Primakov and other prominent Russian politicians. And the aim of this alternative system is weaken existing Western institutions and weaken the Western power. Another thing that Russia is doing while attacking the Western institutions is raising the doubts about the universality of the Western values, democracy, human rights. They say that some alternative values or system based on alternative values, more appropriate, not for Western powers, should be created. And that is also dangerous for the Western societies because, well, that's very interesting why there are some supporters of those ideas among the Western societies. So cooperative model did not work, and actually I think it was yesterday that Sergei Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, said that European Union is guilty for the deteriorating situation in Europe. And he as well might be right. Because I believe that Western society also made a lot of mistakes in its relations vis-à-vis Russia. First of all, I believe that Western society lacks a resilience, inability to recognize Russia, current Russia, Russian regime, not as a partner, but as a competitor, and to develop a clear strategy how to act, how to engage with the competitive. Secondly, it lacks the unity. And third, there is a fatigue and not readiness to fight to the Western values in the societies of the Western countries. Societies are used to a good life. They are not ready to fight. So I think that new strategy for Russia based on competitiveness instead of cooperation have to be proposed, has to also involve the elements of soft power, elements discouraging the deviation from the common position of the Western countries, because there are certain Western countries that try to engage in cooperation with Russian regime, I'm finishing, and disregard this importance of the unity of common Western position. And I think that above all, these relations with between the Western society and Russia has to be based on the rule of law and also not on the unpreconditioned dialogue. So, and I truly believe, I really hope that there would be some change in the change in the relation between West and Russia. But I don't think that more cooperative approach is possible until there is no change in the regime in Russia. And not because the West can't engage with the current government, but I don't think that there is willingness and readiness on the part of current Russian regime engage in the more cooperative way with the Western society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margarita. Just one question, if I may, because you were describing how we came to this situation and what is Russia's plans and how Russia has been trying to antagonize the West and be this competitiveness or this competitor to the Western countries. And the question is, do you think that Russia has achieved this goal? Has Russia actually become an alternative power pole or in a global system? Or is it only seen and should be seen only as a temporary security threat?
I think that the current regime, they don't see that there are possibilities of having, for example, the same power as they used to have during the Soviet Union time. But the point is that by playing asymmetric goals, by challenging international system, you are gaining more power than you might have without doing those things. So being a destructive player and playing according, the realist rules of game, you are increasing your power. But I don't think that there is a sincere belief that Russia would claim the strategic parity with the United States as it is indicated in the Russian national security strategy. I don't think that they think that they would achieve this. And me personally, I also don't think that they achieved it or they will achieve it. I think that it's a temporary game to higher up, make the stakes higher.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Margarita. Thank you for answering this question now, because we're going to turn to the Russian side and see what is their response to the same situation. Let me introduce you, Professor Dr. Igor Yurgens, who's he's listed not in a very correct manner his affiliation in the program, as he's currently a chairman of the and the president of the Institute of Contemporary Development. And he has also been, since 2001, a president of Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, has been working for the UNESCO Secretariat, has a quite extensive knowledge on the economics and financial system. If I have forgotten something, feel free to expand the information, but in this case, the floor is yours. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure to talk to you all this morning and this afternoon. I think in 3 minutes I'll try to give the story, the saga of Mr. Putin's presidency, and what's left I will try to give my recipes of what to do after Ukrainian crisis. In 2000, Mr. Putin arrived with his team from St. Petersburg as the reformer and a lover of European Union, United States, NATO, and all these things. I was in his escort in 2002 when we signed the first declaration with the European Union on strategic partnership. In 2003, he asked Lord Robertson, then Secretary General of NATO, how to get membership in NATO. Lord Robertson gave him the criteria and said that you'll be lining up after Bulgaria because we have no. He said, no, after Bulgaria, that's a little bit too much. But we were seriously contemplating at that time the political structures of NATO to be joined by Russian Federation. In 2001, you remember that when Twin Towers were attacked by terrorists, he gave everything he could to his fellow President George W. Bush in terms of military support and transitory routes to Afghanistan to fight Taliban. Around the same time, replying to some requests from the United States, he gave up Lourdes, which was the fantastic facility for Russian intelligence in Cuba, eavesdropping on the whole territory of the United States. He just shut down the facility. And then a year later, he gave up the jewel of Russian defense in Cam Ranh base, which bottlenecked the Chinese in the Southern Sea. And our Vietnamese base had gone also on the request of the United States, and we had a strategic friendship. George W. Bush saw a human being and a friend in Mr. Putin, and that was very reciprocal. All he wanted in reply, in kind, sort of, is his control over the territories of the post-Soviet Union, with the exception of Baltic republics. I wouldn't say that hegemonical control, but nevertheless, he wanted NATO infrastructure to be as far from the ex-borders of the Soviet Union as possible. And he got some assurances that NATO, with the extension of NATO and with the extension of European Union, will not bring military infrastructure closer to Russian borders. That didn't happen. Each time new country asked for membership, NATO infrastructure was getting closer and closer. Then he'd think that humiliation and betrayal reached a stage of military threat when in Kosovo, in Romania and Bulgaria, very serious NATO facilities were built. And then ballistic missile system, which was created by the United States in Europe, was installed or were almost installed in Poland and Czech Republic. Here, the military wing of Russian administration came to him saying that enough is enough and something has to be done. 2007, Munich Security Conference, he comes and says, either you take Russia seriously, gentlemen, or you'll face the consequences. And he steps down, he gives a relay to young President Medvedev, giving him a chance during 4 years to reset all of this back again. We tried our best, in spite of very serious internal deliberations and confrontation, Mr. Medvedev arranged for reset with President Obama, signed START 1 agreement, made some concessions to Norwegians and some other members of NATO on border demarcation and stuff like that. And then, in spite of strong resistance from military and diplomatic corps, he attended in 2010 the Lisbon meeting of NATO, where almost a memorandum of understanding of strategic partnership with NATO was signed. All of that ended up by Libyan case. Internally, I can tell you that Libya and Magnitsky case, two things which were adopted by the United States or under United States pressure, made things very sour at home. Libya was a deception, they thought, and Magnitsky case was an intrusion into the domestic affairs when corruption will be fought by the outside force and not by the Russians themselves. After that, Mr. Putin decided that enough is enough. He comes back. He tells Mr. Medvedev that it will not go. We have to stand firm and proud. And what happened is happened. I can tell you that his face when he realized that Maidan raised up against Russia during the Sochi conference, which he thought was his jewel, crown jewel. Nobody believed that Sochi Olympic Games could be arranged in such short time, and so on and so forth, so much so that Russian team won. And then the message was brought by specially trained people that Maidan is up, Victoria Nuland is there, and McCain is coming. And you should have seen his face. It was a total game changer, and the rest of it in Ukraine was simply a reactionary, but very quick reactionary gestures in Crimea, in Lugansk, Donetsk, to enhance his own chances. So this is a personal saga. If I have 1 minute or two, and I watched the others, so I think I have 1 minute, I can tell you that what is to be done. This is a continental rift at the moment, the way it looks. We had it before, 1856 Crimean War, First Crimea War, 2015 Second Crimea War, continental rift. It will take some time, but we don't have to despair. We have to seriously sit down and figure out how to deal with it. We have a package of agreements and like Minsk II, like gas agreement, like associate membership, postponed, suspended agreement on Ukraine. We should use our time. We should bring the German chairmanship in OSCE next year to a fruition, and by the end of 2016, we have to have a summit on European security system, on de-escalation and complete regulation of the Ukrainian crisis, and on so-called Marshall Plan 2 for Ukraine on the economic side. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for giving a perspective on how the situation can be developing. I have only one question left, but that was actually already came to my mind a long time ago when the former foreign minister of Hungary was speaking, and he said that one of the solutions for the current Russian Western withstanding would be interdependence. And the question is, well, how economically, how strong is Russia? Because Putin, during his speech at the end of the last year, he was saying that, well, we have to expect a couple of years when the economy is going to be bad, and then it's going to be back on track. How do you see? Is that true? And can Russia? Is Russia that integrated with the Western countries? And isn't this sanctions and embargoes hurting their relationship on economic way that much that Russia could actually end up in isolation?
We are very interdependent. Russia depends on the United States to the lesser degree, but our turnover, trade turnover with the European Union is more than 50%, close to 60%. We lost 8 percentage points, but we're still very dependent on the European markets, technological market, investment market, institution market, benchmarking in human rights, in democracy, on many other things. Enlightened Russia wants to be Europe, no question about that. 15–16% firmly state, in spite of all the propaganda and information war which is waged in Russia at the moment, 16–17% would firmly say we are Europeans, we want to be with Europe, and we want to behave as Europeans. 86% would say no, we are the besieged fortress, and the European Union and NATO is to blame for this also. It will go. Sanctions bite, and bite seriously. The situation in Russia, the Russian economy can be described as SOS, structural reform, oil prices, and sanctions. These three factors are very important for Russian economy, and the sooner we get out of the conflict on Ukraine, de-escalate the crisis, and the sooner we deal with the at least financial sanctions, the better for the Russian economy, but I should say also quite beneficial for some of our partners in the West. The sooner, the better.
Thank you, Professor Yurgens. Germany was mentioned as one of the possibilities to manage the situation, not only by different analysts, but also just now by Professor Yurgens. So in this case, I will turn to Karsten Voigt, a politician and a former member of the German Parliament and currently board member of Atlantik-Brücke, an association which promotes German-American relationships, and also as a board member of the German Council on Foreign Relations. Please, the floor is yours.
In certain parts of my life, I was responsible for the US government. In certain parts of my life, I was responsible for Russia or the Soviet Union. Having listened to you, let me make a half-ironic, half-serious remark. What Germans and Russians have in common, they have many things in common, is, among others, that they have made major mistakes in the history. And we will look from the hindsight whether this was another one. I've met a Chinese delegation coming to Berlin a couple of weeks ago, and they were Chinese specialists on Ukraine and Russia. And they were coming to Berlin to discuss with me and others about the Ukrainian situation and Russian situation. It's in itself an interesting fact. And I will not say what I said. You will hear it now anyhow. But they came to the conclusion that this situation in Ukraine and around Ukraine will change the European political landscape more than 9/11. And I fear they are right. We have, after 89 and after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 91, had a period which from a German viewpoint was defined by a parallel process of cooperation and integration. And integration, where in the Council of Europe it was possible, trade and cooperation, NATO, EU and Russia cooperation as much as possible. We have come very far. And so it's not only a disaster, seen with my eyes. The history of the relationship between Russia and especially the European Union has seen many problems, but until 2 or 3 years ago, no Russian official was against a close cooperation between, or association between, Ukraine and the European Union. So this is a new element, and you didn't mention the European Union as one of the sources of complaints either. But the EU element formally is the reason why all this crisis escalated around the Crimea and with the disappearance of Yanukovych. I think we are now in a new phase. It's not that I like it. I don't know how long it lasts, whether for decades or for years. At least it will last for years. It's a period in which we, on one side, should strive for as much cooperation as possible. On the other side, we have to face the realities that mistrust is there again. Threat perceptions are there, by the way, not only from NATO side, but also from the Russian side. So that we have to deal with the fact that there's, on one side, as much cooperation as possible, on the other side, it's about protection against risks and dangers. That means not only military calculations come in, but also military calculations come in. This is a new phase. And we are now in a phase in the post-Minsk situation in which we are not solving the problem, in which we are not reviving the vision of a pan-European situation in which Russia is a close partner of Europe in the transatlantic community. That's our final vision as to have a constructive Russia in a close relationship with Europe, and that Russia on the other side wants a close relationship with Europe. That's our vision. We are not in this phase. We are now in a phase in which we try to contain a military conflict. It's not a crisis, it's a war. It's not a Cold War, it's a hot war. And some of the agreement on which we agreed, 75, OSCE, were part of the constructive phase in the Cold War. So even that is challenged. The energy cooperation started in the 70s, not after 91. So some of these basic cooperative elements which were there even in the end of the Cold War are now challenged. And on the other side, there are new elements. For example, the sentence of Putin that the end of the Soviet Union was the greatest geostrategic tragedy in the 20th century gives me the impression, as an outsider again, that Putin at least has the desire not to be recognized as a country which Russia is, a great European and Asian, but more European than Asian, European power, with the outreach beyond that, but that's what wants to be recognized as something what it was, an empire. And therefore, if you want to be recognized as what you are not is, the other neighbors perceive you as being revisionist. And this is a problem which we are facing now. So let us now try to manage this conflict. We don't know whether it's be possible, but if not, the situation would escalate enormously. If we contain it, if we manage it, we can open the one or the other constructive path again. But this is in the final end not only to be decided by the Western forces, it's about internal self-perceptions inside Russia. And there is a close interrelationship between domestic relationship, internal developments inside Russia, and foreign policy developments, like in the US. When Russia was stopping its internal reform process, its foreign policy became also slightly different, less attractive for us. And we cannot change from outside Russia. We can't, especially not change it against its will. And we will not try to do that. And Putin would object to it, and we are objecting to it. But this means that if we want a real constructive relationship inside Russia, something inside Russia has to change. And we can talk about it, we can open doors, we can start with constructive steps, but when you open the door, Russia has to move through the door. So what we are trying is now to assist Ukraine, to give our partners inside NATO, in the Baltic states, the guarantee that they will not be alone, but the Germans, in spite of trying to discussing with the Russians, it doesn't mean that we sacrifice the interest. It's not the power concert of the 19th century. We will not make an agreement with Russia above the heads of the Baltic states or any other nations. There is a dissymmetry between power and influence of small and bigger nations, but there is equal power to them and equal rights to them, and this is a fundamental principle. And therefore, we cannot go back to the principles of the 19th century or the previous century, because then we would recreate all problems in Europe. Therefore, we can be pragmatic with Russia as it is, but we can change the situation in Europe to the better only if something is changing, especially in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Voigt. Just one quick question, because you ended with quite a positive note on how the European Union countries are perceiving the European Union member states. The question is, how do you think, what is the future for the European Union enlargement or enlargement of NATO? Aren't we going to be clashing all the time with the Russian interests, and this has now been just simply and plainly stated by the Russian side?
I think there will be sooner or later a NATO enlargement in the Baltic states. Russia will be against it, but it doesn't really touch Russian core security interest. Then we will have other steps of EU enlargement or not. It's again in the Baltic states or in the Balkan region. And beyond that, EU will not be enlarged because of Russia's objection, but because most of the EU partners don't like to enlarge the European Union. So I think this is not when we discuss about EU enlargement and NATO enlargement. In the foreseeable future, we are discussing issues which are not, at least should not be of directly concern for Russia, but are results of our internal domestic discussions inside NATO and inside the EU.
Okay, thank you. With this, we finish the panel discussion, but now the floor is open to questions, please. Yes, raise your hand and state your name and affiliation, please. There's one hand. Are there any more at this point? No. Okay, so there's a gentleman over there.
Dr. Semeny from Kiev. I have actually the question to all the panelists. Namely, we have been talking much about the position of Russia, the position of the EU countries, and now from my perspective, Ukrainian, I would like to put you the question, what input or what contribution would you expect or would you like to have from Ukraine either to de-escalate or to settle the Ukraine crisis?
Okay, the question is to all the panelists. So who's going to start answering first?
It's a very tough question, and I'm not sure if I would be able to answer. But I think that at this stage, what is important for Ukraine is to proceed with the reforms, and this is the most important issue, and certain political unity and successful reforms. But I understand and feel you fully that reforms cannot be as successful as there is a war going on, and in terms of investment and ensuring that investors wouldn't be afraid in coming to Ukraine. This war actually deteriorates the situation and lessens the chances of the successful reforms. So I don't have an immediate answer. Maybe my colleagues would elaborate on this more, but from our point of view, the most important thing for Ukraine is political unity and reforms. And then things maybe would be solved.
Identical answer. The real issue is domestic stability, and domestic stability you only get if you have dramatic reforms, and they will be complicated, but you must implement them, otherwise I think you will not be a stable nation. Second, I have been in the last year, I've been in my life several times there, but I've been last year not only in Kiev, but in Dnipropetrovsk, in Kharkiv, and in Odessa. And the mood there is changing in the direction, pro-Ukrainian direction. In a certain way, Putin is helping to unite the Ukrainian nation and creating it in a certain way. But the mood in some parts is different. There are even people who are ambivalent about Russia and Ukraine. It's changing in direction of a more Ukrainian sentiment, but it's there. And I think that the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian population is well advised to respect and integrate also those elements in Ukrainian society who don't think like the people in Kiev. Because if you cannot govern in such an extreme situation, you cannot govern a country when you only have 70%. 70% are a lot, but if you in some quarters have 50% or 30% who are not clear in which direction they are going, then you need to integrate them. And you cannot, and this is a very complicated issue, and there you come to political culture. Some people are saying that elections are a civilized form of civil warfare. I'm not so clear how far this civilization process has gone on inside the Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Voigt. Mr. Yurgens.
Yeah, I would subscribe to what was. I think the consolidation of Ukrainian society around Poroshenko at this time. Poroshenko is definitely a president who can tackle things, including the conversations with our president. Consolidation around Poroshenko would be an enormous contribution, but Ukraine alone will not be able to tackle all the economic problems. So European Union and other allies who said that they are firmly behind Ukraine should come up with something more tangible than the promise of $17.5 billion, which is a peanuts. Ukraine needs 100 until 2018 to solve the most urgent problems. And then if it's not solved, then the social unrest in some of the areas of Ukraine would have nothing to do with Russia. It would be internal Ukrainian problem. To do this, you have to consolidate your oligarchs because, you know, Renat Akhmetov, Firtash, Kolomoisky, Poroshenko himself, other guys, Pinchuk, we tried to reach them. We tried to reach them as a consolidated Russian Union of Industrialists or then through Business Europe. It's very difficult. I don't want to get involved into that, and I'm not going to comment on that, but unless you consolidate those tsars of the regions who have a lot of influence, even democratic Russia, and I'm the subscriber with the president of Virgin Airlines for the international campaign of looking for the sponsors for the Ukrainian economy and for the investors into the Ukrainian economy. We know the situation. Unless you do this consolidation of oligarchs, or rather de-oligarchization of Ukraine, then I think that it would be a very difficult process.
Thank you, Mr. Yurgens.
I agree strongly with what's just been said. I think the main contribution that Ukraine can make is to focus on its internal reform challenges and to pursue those. We all need Ukraine to be a successful, stable, economically viable state in the heart of the European continent, and I think that's the biggest contribution it could make to stability. However, I did say earlier in my opening comments that I had a concern about whether Ukraine would be allowed to pursue its reform agenda if it was in a defenseless position. And so I think part of the reform agenda needs to be to ensure that Ukraine has a professional, democratically accountable military which is capable of defending its territory, not engaging in offensive operations, but in a kind of civil defense kind of way. I think that's an important part of the process, but that must be professionalized and it must be democratically accountable. You know, I strongly agree with the points just made by Igor Yurgens about the need to consolidate political power and authority and to deal with the challenge of the oligarchs. And some of that, of course, connects with the whole issue of volunteer battalions. And I'm not saying that necessarily all of the volunteer battalions have been a big problem. I know the role they've played in the defense of certain parts of Ukraine, but those kinds of issues have to be addressed, I think, so that Ukraine is a stable, democratic, and economically viable state. And that would be a huge contribution to getting us out of the situation we're in.
Thank you, Jan. Okay, questions? Yes, and now we can gather some questions. Yes, please.
Richard Martin Hempel of the Baltic Times. Just a very quick question about how the West should look to approach Russia's growing presence in the Arctic, whether they should look to contain or engage with this process. And further, I wonder if you could say a little bit about how the West should, if it can at all, engage with Russia in environmental policy.
Thank you. And the question goes to? The panel. Okay. Okay, there was a second hand which I saw. Okay, then I saw something wrong. Okay, so in this case, if the panel is, but in this case, may we start with Jan?
Sure. Well, thanks for the question. I think we should engage. I don't think our frame for engaging with Russia on Arctic issues or environmental issues or any other issues should be, except in the European theatre, should be in any way linked to containment or thinking about it in that kind of way. I think we should be looking to cooperate with Russia on some of these issues. I mean, last time I checked the data, Russia was the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. What that tells me is that we collectively don't get a solution to the climate change problem unless we work with Russia along with all of the other major countries to address it. I get frustrated when I hear people say we shouldn't cooperate with Russia as though this is a kind of statement of principle. I mean, nobody that I know who's a serious analyst or thinker about international affairs has suggested that we stop cooperating with Russia on Iran negotiations. What that tells me is that the frame of relations can and should be cooperation whenever and wherever possible, and certainly when it's in our interests to pursue cooperation. That's the important question. When it's in our interests to cooperate. Environmental areas are one, Iran nuclear negotiations are another. I would put the Arctic in the same basket. We do not need to have the dynamic that has developed in the European theatre exported to other parts of the international system if we can avoid it. We need to find a way of resisting some of what has happened inside the European theatre, but to keep open the channels of cooperation and dialogue and not wait for some future date when suddenly things might be much better. We need to pursue the areas of cooperation now where we can pursue cooperation successfully. And of course I didn't mention the Syrian chemical weapons instance. This may have been a transactional arrangement and we've done it without, in a context of great hostility and mistrust. But if it was a transactional arrangement conducted in mistrust, I would argue that it was one of huge international significance and it was well worth having. And if we can find others like that, we should pursue them and take them.
Thank you. Thank you, Yawn. Mr. Yurgens?
The chairmanship on the Arctic Council, which is the body which regulates everything which is happening in Arctic, went to United States this year. It will depend largely on the U.S. administration how to build up this relationship. It's a very difficult area. It's 1/4 of the world hydrocarbons and everybody looking in the direction of Arctic. We know of the attempts of Chinese Republic to be not only observer but a full member of the Arctic Council. At the moment it's being resisted both by Russia and the United States, but China will be there. It builds up a fleet of icebreakers which otherwise is useless for them. They want to be there in Arctic. So it's a very serious question, and it will depend largely on the United States leadership this year, particularly in Arctic Council, how relationship will develop. Russians are ready for almost any eventuality. They created so-called Arctic Command. They built up a military base there on their territory, which is legitimate, but is scary. So we'll see.
Thank you. Mr. Voigt?
I agree.
Thank you. Margarita?
I would propose, the strategy of competition or containment to separate into parts. One is political and military issues, and the other is so-called low political issues, low politics. So I would say on the political and military level, the strategy has still to be a containment strategy, and also in Arctic. When we talk about environment, engagement with the society, these are entirely different issues. And there, I believe, there are the possibilities for closer cooperation, also among other regions in Arctic.
Thank you. We have a little bit of time for the last round. So in this case, there was one hand, there's two, three, four hands. So we're gonna gather 4 questions, but this time please state to the exact panelist you want to ask the question to. And because we have to finish at 5:30, because there's some tasty food, as I have been informed, waiting for us outside. So yes, please, let's start with you. A microphone, please.
So I'd like to ask Mr. Yurgens an economic question. We know that the economic side of the association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union has been deferred, postponed until the end of next year, I think.
It's 16.
Yeah, 16. And my question is, do you see any way in which it can be reconciled, the free trade area that would arise with the European Union, and at the same time, the present free trade with Russia? Because this was what started.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Blix is such a wonderful personality in this world that I would prefer to answer his question than the question of others. Would you be?
Okay.
Because before I forget, Mr. Blix, it's a very good question. I think it's relatively easy. If no politics involved, then on this trade issue, there should be an agreement signed between three parts on the certificate of the origin, which is Ukraine signs that any product coming from the European Union to Ukraine, if value added is not on the Ukrainian territory, more than 40% or something like that, is considered a European Union. And then there is a customs declaration between Russian Federation and Ukraine on the electronic exchange of this customs clearance. And then Russians put an extra charge on it as a European product and not Ukrainian one. The difficulty is that Ukraine didn't get out of the CIS customs union area. So they are still members of both. So from this point of view, if European Union product comes to Ukraine, there could be, just packaged as Ukrainian, which is added value for that, and then sent to Russia as a Ukrainian one without customs duty. Okay, this is the issue. It's not enormous amount of money, mind you, but it's $8 billion of potential damage to Russian producers who do the same thing on the territory of Russian Federation. But by signing two things, that could be straightened out. There is some politics in it, and the politics goes back to Eastern Partnership. I didn't have time to discuss it this morning, but I can tell you, when Eastern Partnership was negotiated, 6 countries, as you know, Russian Federation was approaching the European Union. I personally went to Barroso's office back in 2007, saying that, could we discuss the trilateral agreement of Eastern Partnership? Because there are 6 countries, you earmarked in Eastern Partnership about 400 million euros for democracy, rule of law, for technical standards, many things which are Eastern Partnership is built for. We were spending at the same time, for the same period of time, Russian Federation $4 billion in trade subsidies, in restructuring of the gas and oil deals and stuff like that. So our proposal was, let's discuss it trilaterally. The answer was, at that time, very polite, because we had a honeymoon between Russia and the European Union, so the answer was polite, but the essence of the answer was, there is no such thing as a format of discussing something which we discussed with somebody, with the third party. Bye-bye, Russian Federation. So we were not even invited into the Prague summit, which launched Eastern Partnership. There is the outcome. 3 countries are okay with the Eastern Partnership and the EU, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. 3 countries do not care less, Belarus, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. They are members of the others. So, on the verge of signing this declaration of non-adherence to EU and rather to Russia by Yanukovych, I know of the blitz visit of our Minister of Economy saying that let's discuss the associate membership of Ukraine in the European Union and in customs union. And that could have done the deal. That probably, if Yanukovych announces that, okay, we're members of associate agreement, we signed associate agreement with the EU, but also with the customs union, probably no Maidan. We will say, no, there is no such thing as dual membership. You see, so there are some things which we can correct even now.
Thank you. Now the 3 questions, please. Yes, please, the microphone in the middle.
Okay. My question is regarding the people-to-people aspect, because politics is not only conducted on the high level, but also on a societal level. So what would be the networks that people should focus on in order to engage in contact between countries from the West and from Russia? Would it be universities? Would it be NGOs? And as I understand, you said that U.S. has stopped sending some people to Russia and doesn't allow them to go, or something along those lines. So yes, my question would be how to ensure that on a lower level we try to reach an understanding rather than returning to the us versus them dialogue. Yes.
Thank you, Alina. The question was to okay.
Dr. Kearns.
Okay, thank you. The second question was somewhere also in the middle of this. Yes.
Yes, thank you. My name is Tom. I'm from Riga Students University, and I want to say that it's an open question. I would like to hear all of your opinions. And it's about so that we know that the recent military activities in Europe have made all of the nations uneasy. So what would be the most compatible solution to both sides, meaning the NATO forces and Russia? How would they see the best solution in this situation to let the forces rotate near their borders, or would a buffer zone would be way more better? Thank you.
Thank you. And the third question?
Thank you. My question goes to Mr. Yurgens and Mr. Voigt. I listened to your interventions, and I heard about the mistrust in both directions, the Russian mistrust towards the West and NATO and Libya and so on, and our Western mistrust towards Russia after breaking the rules, intervening in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. My question is, how do you, Mr. Yurgens, see this future of a German OSCE leadership in 2016 and a new summit with new principles? How can we do that in 1-2 years with the existing mistrust? And Mr. Voigt, if you're not having the German OSCE chairmanship, but you are German, how do you see that being possible? Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to start with Yawn answering the first question, and then we could move to Mr. Yurgens and Voigt answering the third question. And Margarita, could you address the second question, please? Okay? Yawn, please.
Thanks. Well, I think we should be pursuing a dialogue on visa-free travel with Russia. I think we should be expanding educational links with Russia at all levels. I think we should be promoting as much civil society dialogue with organizations in Russia as possible. I think it's an understandable political reflex that people have looked to close down channels of engagement. But the truth of the matter is that our political leaders are closing down channels of engagement as a form of gesture politics to demonstrate their displeasure with what's gone on. And I think whilst one can understand that reflex, it's not an approach which is going to lead us into a more productive dialogue. And I think we need to shift the frame from that and to focus on trying to build as many levels of dialogue as possible, which I would include also the reopening, as it were, of the NATO-Russia Council. I think that the EU and Russia should have summits, not abandon them. We're in a very serious situation, and just to say that we're going to isolate Russia or close down all of the channels of communication, I think it's just a very unwise thing to do.
Thank you, Yawn. Mr. Yurgens?
Oh, that's a question of trust. So if I take Yawn by his words, and if the position of the West is not the regime change in Russia, which would be, I think, a mistake, because at the moment, Russian leadership, or at least one part of the Russian leadership, which is most powerful part, thinks that there is a concept of regime change, of some kind of a Russian Maidan being organized, enhanced, and created by the outside forces, and so on and so forth. I know that their suspicions are blown out of proportion, but you know how very well trained people deliver such messages. So at the moment, if we start with the Serbian chairmanship in OSCE, and I heard Mr. Vučić, the Prime Minister of Serbia, saying that there are a number of steps which Serbs would take using, first of all, their chairmanship in OSCE, and second, their special relationship with Russians. So if we start with this, and if we enhance the OSCE supervisory role in Ukraine, if we put more OSCE observers on the ground, if we give them more equipment, if we manage to demilitarize the Donetsk-Lugansk part of the Ukrainian border, if we manage, which Poroshenko promised, and I'm sure will do, arrange for the regional elections in Donbass and Lugansk, and with the help of Putin, put some of the hotheads on Donetsk and Lugansk, so-called People's Republic, into check. If we do all of this, then German chairmanship starts with the positive note. We can work out the procedures like we did in 1972, 1975 for the Helsinki Act. At that time, the trust was no better than today. Probably worse, because I do remember whiskey on the rocks, looking at you, Mr. Blix, when Russian submarine was found in Stockholm, archipelago, and so on and so forth, many other things. So the trust is not an issue for the summit, which would decide that here are the new rules of the game which should not be violated, and some kind of mechanism to watch it. Because what Russians used as a pretext was Kosovo, of course, when somebody was recognized in the unrecognized state by somebody without United Nations declaration, and some other instances we all know, Libya, Iraq, Syria, and all of that stuff. So if we come to the summit after a year of very diligent Ordnung und Disziplin kind of a work which only Germans can organize in Europe, and OSCE too, then I think in ideal world, by the end of 2016, we can come with something which would be called Helsinki 2 or I don't know. But that's probably some of you will say it's wishful thinking. But without wishful thinking, there is no thinking at all.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Voigt, have you anything to add?
We have to combine analytical skepticism with intentional optimism, which means that we have to find constructive answer, and to build trust and confidence means that you do not pre-assume it, because otherwise you wouldn't need to verify. So trust is not a precondition, but should be the result. So second, on buffer zone, I simply want to say, in the NATO-Russia agreement, we practically have defined a limited military presence in the new member states of NATO, because there are no nuclear weapons, there are no permanent deployment of heavy troops, and the question is whether this can be changed further. And I think simply not, because then those respective countries are concerned that we don't take their defense serious. And therefore, what we are now trying is to balance with the spearhead and with the permanent repetition of short-term deployments. We confirm on one side our commitments to the treaties which we didn't undermine. That means no nuclear weapons. But on the other side, we make clear that we do not sacrifice NATO members in the eyes of Russian concerns. And I think this is needed inside the alliance, and therefore a buffer zone for these small countries. If Russia announces a buffer zone, so that's fine, I'm not against it. But for these small countries, which don't have the territorial depth as Russia, to define a buffer zone is simply in military things, and in political terms, it's not acceptable.
Thank you, Mr. Voigt. And Margarita, could you?
I'll try to be consistent, and I would still argue that, international system based on the rule of law and values of liberal democracy is of the utmost importance for all the Western society, whereas the power politics, buffer zones, and things like that brings us back to the 19th century. So each country has to choose their own foreign and security policy and make their own decisions how to protect the country. So small countries or not, but we are the countries, and we have to make the choices. And all those talks about not provoking the Russia, if someone wants to be provoked, then it gets provoked. And we just can remember the recent event with the Danish Russian ambassador in Denmark, when there was a threat against certain things that Denmark might make the choices that would provoke Russia. I think it's not the talk of the 21st century, and it's especially dangerous. Stick to the rule of law and the values of liberal democracy. That's very important.
Thank you. Thank you.
The questioner was a Dane. The person who asked the
I
question
know,
was a
I
Dane.
know, I know.
Could hear the
In this case, I have to be summarizing all this, but as time has run out, I'm not going to do that. But I'm very glad to hear positive notes and hope and the lessening of the fear, which with which I actually started all this discussion. So in this case, the food is outside, but before that, please a round of applause to the distinguished panelists.